This episode is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, who invites you to give the gift of great beer this holiday season. A gift membership is the perfect way to bring friends and family into the homebrewing hobby, and what's more, you can choose a free book with your gift card purchase. Visit homebrewersassociation.org for details, and make sure to place your order by December 15th to ensure you receive your free book in time for the holidays. homebrewersassociation.org. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 11th, 2021, Veterans Day. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Sean Slape of Crisis Brewing talks about managing growth of his once tiny brewery, managing yeast, and managing to brew some delicious beers. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows, and if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewer's logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and many thanks to everybody who is helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. Financial supporters have already seen the video episode that I plan to post this coming Friday about Steve's simple but delicious Martzen. In my mind, fest beers are always in season, and Steve's was certainly festive. And it is a holiday season, after all. Along those lines, we'll be taking Thanksgiving week off, as usual, to eat way too much and see family that we don't see enough nowadays. Also, I may take an extra week off next month because our son is coming home for the first time since before the pandemic. So I want to have that flexibility to do what he wants to do while he's at home. I've already gotten some disaster stories for our annual Disaster Show episode that will run the last week of the year. But Steve and I always record that ahead of time. So if you have a brewing disaster that you've had this past year that you want to share and think is worth a chuckle or maybe a gasp and want to share it with all the listeners, please take a couple minutes and send that to james@basicbrewing.com. And you don't have to include photos of your injuries, please. And brevity is the soul of wit, said the guy who wrote really long plays. I love long, funny stories, but keep in mind I'll be reading these aloud, maybe after drinking and during drinking a homebrew, or maybe two. Very much appreciate everybody who sends in those every year, and it's something that we look forward to very much. Every year. I have two projects in the fermenter right now. One is a rosemary beer brewed with resuscitated yeast that you'll hear me talk about later in the show. And the other is the next sampler, and that sampler is focused on bread yeast. Now, I swear I had bought the ingredients for this one, and then I saw the Brewlosophy podcast posted a couple weeks ago about the bread yeast. So we're on the same wavelength, I think. I'm not copying, I swear. But I think this is going to be a fun one. And speaking of fun, Wild Hunt from our friends and sponsors Ricky and Kelly from Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies is almost gone. Ricky the Mead Maker says, delicious seasonal Wild Hunt's days are numbered, and it won't be back until next year. Now, Wild Hunt is a balanced blend of honey, of course, cranberry, blood orange, and spice brewed in honor of the ceremonial meads of 18th century Northern Europe. It's ruby red, it smells of cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, and tastes of bright citrus, cranberry, cloves, and cinnamon on the finish. Now think of a blood orange mimosa. You can get Groenfell and Havoc meads shipped across the country from Vermont where they're born. So think of sipping this deliciously drinkable 6.2% mead at the family table during the holiday season, or maybe at midnight when you're standing in the light of the open fridge gathering ingredients for a crazy turkey sandwich with cranberry sauce right on there, on the turkey, with a little warmed-up gravy drizzled and oozing out the sides. Not that I've done anything like that in the past ever. Get Wild Hunt from Groenfell before it's gone at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's Groennfell. Now I'm thirsty and hungry. Okay. As you know, I have a part of my mission with this show documenting the craft beer industry around where I live here in Northwest Arkansas. And I think it's helpful for you, the listener, because I know a lot of you start thinking about opening a brewery the first time you stand at the brew pot smelling the wort. And I think that talking to professionals is a sort of class for homebrewers with those ambitions. And I often hear from homebrewers gone pro who have listened to the show over the past 16 or 17 years. Not that I'm taking any credit for that, but, it's all a part of the education and, let you know maybe some of the pitfalls as well as the successes. And my goal is to get practical tips, as usual, on brewing that we can use in our own home setups. Now, this conversation is an excellent example of all that. You may remember I first talked to Sean back in 2018 as the little two-barrel Crisis Brewing was just getting off the ground. But now, Sean and his wife Liz have added on to their serving space, and they've added another 7 barrels of capacity to keep up with the demand for their delicious beers. Sean Slape, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Oh, thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you again.
I quizzed you before we started talking, and it's been 3.5 years since we talked, and we've only talked for one time. I swear that we had talked for the show more than once, and I would have sworn that it was a shorter amount of time. But we've had kind of this time compression that's happened. The time space has been warped and bent, between then and now, and we actually have had a crisis.
That's correct. Well, we've actually talked many times in between our interviews. I see you here at the brewery. I catch you every couple of months, so it's not that I haven't had a chance to talk to you on a regular basis. Just more of a for your show.
Just off the record.
Yes, off the record.
So in those past 3.5 years, and we've got to take into account the pandemic, which is a bit of craziness. Yeah. What were your biggest surprises in the way, what were your expectations, and how did they measure up to how things actually have come about? What were your biggest surprises? Again, besides of course we got to factor in the pandemic, but besides the pandemic, in the past 3.5 years, what has been the most surprising thing or things?
Well, I would have to say that the amount of beer that we've been able to sell through this tiny place, I've never expected that. I always thought that this would be enough. And it turns out that it wasn't, and I think that's a good thing. But I never planned to have a system that would be any bigger than 2 barrels. That's all I ever wanted to brew, and that's the amount of people that I wanted to support. I wanted it to be small neighborhood pub, and I thought I was well on the way for that to happen. And it took me by surprise. The number of people that wanted to drink my beer, really. So that was a big surprise, because I had it all planned out. It was going to be easy. Not easy, but it was going to be stable, and all my numbers were going to work exactly like I expected them to work. And I remember talking to Ben Mills over at Fossil Cove, and he was like, I was asking him before we started, and he was like, just go bigger. And I was like, no, I've got this figured out, And I definitely didn't have the size figured out here. So that and then obviously, other than the pandemic, that's probably the thing that caught me most off guard, that people actually wanted to drink the beer I was making.
It's funny because it's kind of ironic, because I think in the first interview I did with Ben over at Fossil Cove, he was by himself, and he was like, I don't want to have any employees, and he was like wanting to stay small. But here he has his original system, and he's got this 20-barrel system in another building, and coincidentally,
I have a 7-barrel system in another building right now, so that's enabled us to keep up with the demand, still kind of stay towards my desire to be small, but it was necessary to get this bigger system off-site because, as you can see around you, there's nowhere else for anything to happen here, right. And if people want to drink the beer and I can sell it and afford the equipment that I'm buying, I like making beer, so it wasn't like a problem for me. I really enjoyed doing that, but it also was just one more thing that you didn't have planned.
And you have expanded your space into more outdoor areas, and you've covered in this back patio. So you have grown the consumption space more, mainly because I guess of the pandemic, which I guess is a positive outflow.
Well, I think so. I like the outdoors quite a bit, so it works fantastic for me. But I would say we traded our indoor space. We were tiny inside with this space outside on the patio. So, as a result of the pandemic, everybody didn't want to be shoulder to shoulder in this tiny little bar, so it forced us to do this, to be outside. And now, we're at the mercy of the weather, so, we close the place in and go through enormous amounts of propane just to keep everybody happy. But the pandemic has definitely driven everything that you see outside of the pub right now because, that's what we had to do to keep going.
And this is, if people don't recall from 3.5 years ago, the original interview, this is a small sort of shack or shed that you that you have your brew space in, and you built, with kind of mostly sweat equity, the little tasting room part, and y'all are across the parking lot from an excellent barbecue place, which is one way to ensure that we keep coming back, along with the good beers. But then, so talk about the system that your legacy system, and talk about the one that you have now, your newer one, and both are still in play.
Both are still going right now. We brewed yesterday on the 7-barrel system, and we brewed this afternoon on the 2-barrel system. So here we have a 2-barrel electric system. It's just a standard 3-kettle setup, hot liquor tank, mash tun, and kettle. We've got 6 2-barrel, or 3-barrel total volume fermenters that are plastic fermenters. Actually, they're not even stainless steel fermenters that have really punched above their weight for quite some time now. I'm quite impressed with what they're able to do. And then the system down south is a 7-barrel. It's also an all-electric system, both from stout tanks and kettles. And I tried to set it up pretty much the same way to limit any scale-up headaches that I might have, and maybe reduce the amount of, reduce the learning curve that I would have as I went from 2 barrels to 7 barrels. So make everything essentially the same, just a little bit bigger, and limit the damage I can do on my first couple of batches over there. So other than that, the space down there is enormous, so it will allow us for some more expansion if we wanted to do something like barrel aging, or if we wanted to put a small canning line in, but really not, in the immediate future for us anyway. It's there and it's available, but it's not something that we're actively pursuing right now. I'm not, as far as the 7-barrel space is concerned, it is definitely production only. This place, when we're brewing here and the tap room's open, it smells good like brewing beer. Down there, it's an industrial warehouse space, and it's designed for production only, and that's where we actually manage most of our inventory through this place now. We have a huge walk-in cooler down there that's probably pushing 750 square feet, so that's pretty big for us. Wow. And it allows us to brew the beers, keep it down there, rotate our stock, because once we got that 7-barrel system going, it allowed us to up the number of taps. So we went from realistically 6 taps to 14 taps, and our cooler here wasn't designed for that. So we're hauling kegs back and forth quite a bit from our standards, just to keep room in the walk-in cooler so that the bartenders can get in there and change the kegs out.
Well, it sounds like a good problem to have.
I mean, it's certainly, I can think of worse problems. I can think of worse problems.
So it's been about 8 minutes, and I haven't sampled any of the 4 beers in front of me. So where should I start?
I think I would go ahead and I would start with the bitter. It seems like to me it's a kind of a dreary, cloudy day outside, and it looks like the right kind of beer for the weather.
Cheers, by the way.
Oh yes, cheers to you too.
Yeah, it's a dreary day, but it's very warm in here. I probably should have taken off my jacket before we got started. The propane is doing its job out here. Your propane accessories. So talk about this beer.
Well, it's a strong bitter. It's named after a town I lived in England when I was a kid for a couple of years, Swindon, and it's just outside of London. And, depending on your perspective, it's either, it's a strong or a bitter place. So the name worked perfectly for me. And I like English beers, but I know that they're not the greatest selling beers, in the United States, or especially in small towns. IPAs are the things to do. But the reason why we wanted to keep the small system is because I like to make these specialty beers, and if you keep them in small enough batches, they turn fast enough without getting old. So I can make beers that may not necessarily appeal to everybody, appeal to me, and then see how they're received. So I like English bitter beers. I always have, and I wanted one maybe just a little bit more flavorful than a typical English beer that I would drink, and so that's what I was shooting for with this. And as a result, a little bit more malt maybe pushes the alcohol up just a little bit higher, because I liked it to attenuate properly. So it gives you a nice, I think, a light to medium body that's not too sweet, but gives you a lot of, gives you roasty flavors, gives you some really nice esters, fruity esters, I think, that kind of describe what is a bitter English beer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not an expert. I haven't had anything from the source, but this is very nice. It does have a fairly solid malt sweetness, but there's a sharpness from the bitterness that comes in behind it, and balances that well. For those playing bingo at home, the first time I've said balanced, I think.
I try to avoid it as much as possible.
But it's important. You can an unbalanced beer is not pleasant, and you want somebody to take a sip and want another sip.
Well, I would hope that balance goes without saying in most of the beers, so that's why I try very hard not to use it. Use the word.
Clean fermented is another one that you shouldn't have to say, but this is nice, cleanly fermented. There are some fruity esters from I'm assuming from the yeast. So what's the yeast, and where does the color come from?
So it's it's a London ale yeast, and I fermented a little bit warmer than normal. I fermented about 71 degrees because I wanted to get those fruity esters to come out and stand, front and center. I think they did reasonably okay. I lost my train of thought.
And the color?
The color. So the color comes from midnight wheat malt.
Really?
Yes. I just really liked the flavor of that malt, and it's just a tiny, tiny amount. It gives you a color, and I think it may give you a little bit of body. I mean, perceptible, imperceptible. I can't tell whether it comes from the malt, from that midnight wheat or not, or if it's just from the way it was mashed. But I really liked this flavor, the smell of that malt, and I thought I'd give it a try. And that's where I got my color from on this. So it was, Maris Otter. It was pale, and then in order to kind of darken it up a little bit and kind of richen it up, I thought that midnight wheat would work well, even though it's not something you would typically find in an English bitter.
Yeah, that's surprising. Steve and I have done some malt samplers, and Midnight Wheat was one of the beers that we talked about and that we sampled. And there must be just a tiny amount, because this is brown. It's not black at all, but it's not designed to be a super roast bomb. The malt. It just gives it a nice dark color, and there's obviously no ashiness or no burnt flavors. So Sure, why not? Why not use it? Why not use it in this style of beer?
Yeah, and then on top of the warm fermentation, that London ale yeast ferments very fruity to begin with. So I mean, I was looking for that fruity, and I think it would probably overwhelm any of the maybe roasty, malty flavors that midnight wheat would impart, but it'd still allow me to get the color.
Very nice. Are you still using Imperial?
I do. I use Imperial yeast almost exclusively, and I continue to propagate their yeast. Probably for 7 to 10 generations.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's we have the when I was a homebrewer, I had a small half barrel batch, and I use that small system now to prepare wort from dry malt extract for just to give some nutrient to the yeast. If I don't use it within a week, we dump it out, add some fresh wort to it, and stir it up and let it go, and that way I can keep their yeast going for quite some time that way.
Yeah, yesterday, and this is I'm wearing my my Imperial hoodie here. Disclaimer. Didn't necessarily mean for this to turn into a commercial for Imperial, but I've got an 8-month-old pouch of Que Bueno lager yeast that day before yesterday I pitched into a 2-liter starter, and it kicked right up, and it wasn't as aggressive as past starter. I tried to make a 2-liter starter with a fresh batch of Imperial, and it within like an hour, literally, it was over the top of the flask. So, but it's done. 2 days later, and it's done. So anyway. Imperial spot over.
I like those guys a lot. They're always helpful, and I've had a couple of snafus before, and I call them, and they help out. So I stick with people that if somebody treats you right, you probably need to return the favor.
Yeah, amen, brother. Speaking of Imperial organic yeast, you heard it right here. Folks at Imperial love what they do, and they're making it a priority to ensure that all brewers, home brewers, and professionals alike have access to great yeast and friendly and knowledgeable service. And there's big news for sour beer fans. W25 Lacto Brevis is now in homebrew pouches, and I can attest this is true because I already have mine, and I'm planning to do a passion fruit sour with it. Lacto Brevis is extremely hop sensitive, so it's great for kettle souring, for example, which is what I plan to do. Lacto Brevis will typically drop the wort pH to 3.3 in 1 to 4 days, depending on temperature and inoculation rate. We love Imperial. Say it with me. With a pitch rate of 200 billion cells in every easy-to-open package, my stir plate is dusty because I don't use it anymore to make starters for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches. And my beers are usually bubbling before bedtime. Ask your local homebrew store about W25 Lacto Brevis and check out Imperial at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. So on making starters, how do you don't seem to have like laboratory conditions here, right? Or do you get as close to as you can, or what? What advice can you give to homebrewers if you're going to repitch, if you're going to repropagate? What do we have to watch out for?
I mean, I do my best just to keep everything closed up, and then when I'm opening things, I do everything I can to stay sanitary, sanitize the outside of the buckets. Keep the amount of airflow down to a minimum, close vents, make sure doors not open. I mean, we definitely are not a sterile lab and don't have any place to do that. But what I always have hoped is that if I'm trying hard enough to be clean and I have a healthy batch of yeast and I can get that nutrient in there quick enough that it's going to take care of itself and outcompete anything else that's there. And I have yet, knock on wood, to have any issues with infection while we propagate our yeast. And if you were a microbiologist, you would probably be pulling your hair out looking at how we do it. But we don't have access to that kind of that facility or the equipment that somebody that would do that for a living. And it works. I mean, it works. That's all I need for it to work, and it does.
You can't argue with success. That's the thing.
Well, hopefully not. Yes, but I mean, it's also a necessity too. I mean, this kind of goes back to one of the things that maybe what surprised you. I would say the difficulty of managing liquid yeast has. I thought it would maybe be a little bit easier. It is time consuming, especially when you're trying to keep 7 or 8 strains running all the time. And that, I was like, oh, that'll be easy. You just do it, and that's one of the things that caught me off guard. But we do it so much. I think we've got it down so that here's our procedure, and we know that this procedure works every time. And if you just do it like this, the outcome will be, you do A, the outcome will be B, and that's what we've had luck with.
So, what are your proportions? I mean, do you make a certain amount of wort for a certain amount, starter wort for a certain amount of beer, or are there rules that you follow, or do the rules differ from strain to strain?
So I try to keep it as simple as possible, so that if I was training anybody, it makes it a little bit easier. But we do, a simple chlorine dioxide clean wash. And then depending on the volume of yeast that we have, that's the volume of wort that I pitch into that batch at about 1050. And I just let it go from there, and I just monitor I'll pull it out. I'll do yeast cell counts. I'll look at I'll do the viability. I'll look at the vitality of the yeast and go. And that's basically how I determine. I use a microscope and a couple of small pieces of lab equipment to get as much bang for the buck as I can. But I do it exactly the same every time. The only thing that differs is the volume of wort that I pitch into the yeast, and that depends on how much is there. If I got a gallon, I put a gallon of wort in. If I got 3 gallons, I put 3 gallons, and it just keeps it super simple.
Huh. Wow.
And it works.
Yeah.
It works.
Apparently so.
Yes.
So do you? I mean, is like 7 repitches? Is that just an arbitrary number, or are there indications at that stage that the yeast is wearing out or modifying?
There's a couple things that I do, and I don't know that they're particularly scientific. I taste the yeast all the time, and I try to remember. I've been eating that yeast for many years now, so I have a pretty good idea of what it tastes like. I know that sounds strange, but
and a healthy biome.
Yeah. And then when I'm looking at it under the microscope, if the yeast cells just don't seem to look plump and healthy, if I spot like any bacteria under the field of view at all, that could be 2 generations, or that could be 10. But 10 is typically just when I call it quit. Like, I don't care how good it is. At that point in time, I just dump it and start over. It has at that point in time made that purchase of the initial pitch palatable for a small place. I've defrayed the cost of that initial pitch out over 10 generations, and that makes things from a business perspective a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, from a homebrew perspective, I went through a phase where I tried to reuse yeast in different ways. From propagating, from doing the quote-unquote yeast washing technique that you see online, or used to see online, to pitching on top of the dregs in the fermentation bucket, to I just tried different methods. But the thing about it is that as a home brewer, yeast is not that expensive to buy to buy new pouch yeast, and I know that it's going to be good. Again, not being just any new yeast is going to be good, but also I don't want to be tied into a certain strain of yeast for my attention span for brewing different styles is across it's crazy. I can't be sort of be held to a schedule thinking, oh, I got that yeast in the fridge that I got to do something with, so therefore I've got to brew XYZ beer. Whereas you're rotating these things out on a much more regular basis, and so you're better set up to do that.
Yeah, well, I definitely managing liquid yeast for such a small place is definitely tough. But I also try to, the production schedule also helps me extend. So I might not necessarily have to be constantly preparing a starter because, if I brewed an IPA one day and I'm brewing a pale, a week later and it's the same yeast, I let the fermenter do all the work for me, so I don't have to do that. And if I can I do my best to manage my production schedule to minimize that amount of work, but it's near impossible for the size that we are to brew back to back. We don't have enough taps to keep all that going. So inevitably, some yeast is going to start sitting there. And after about a week or two, you're like, I don't know if I want to really pitch this into a beer that I just spent, $1,000 on materials for the yeast to be bad. So we're really concerned about that, but it's just, I guess it's just part of it really now, though, And to be, in all honesty, every yeast that we use here, I don't keep, like, for instance, you said Que Bueno. We make a Mexican lager that I've used that. We make it once a year. So I'm not trying to keep that yeast alive, I'm not trying to keep, 2 or 3 liters of that alive for a year. It's pointless.
Right. Yeah. So where do we go next?
Well, I would say that you might as well go for that Belgian Strong. Let's, give it it's a pretty beer. It's tasty. It'll warm you up. It's a little cool outside, so I think it'll, I think of it as almost like candy. It's delicious to me. It's a simple beer. It's just Pilsner malt, Saaz hops, and some Belgian yeast. And I start cold and let that thing go however it wants to go until it stops. And it puts out a beautiful profile of esters and phenols. And it doesn't get so carried away that you can't handle it, but it sure is. It's sweet in a way that I like juicy fruit gum sweet, but it's dry and it's easy to drink. So it's a dangerous beer if you're not paying attention, if you're not looking at the board and you don't realize what the alcohol content is. It's easy to drink.
Yeah, you said sweet, but it's not. Or you said candy.
Yeah, it's not sweet in the sense that it's like a thick beer. It's dry. It's well attenuated beer for sure.
Yeah, it's really nice. I hope you have crowlers of this beer.
That's anything that's over 9%, we typically don't sell to go. I know, but for you, James, you can have whatever you want.
I won't tell anybody. I forgot I was going to bring my growler, but I didn't. So are growlers a thing of the past now?
No. We get lots of people using growlers all the time. We switched over to crowlers just because it was much easier to fill those 32-ounce cans with a wide mouth than it is to stick a tube into the end of your faucet. We don't have the ability to counter pressure fill or anything like that. You waste a lot of beer foaming. Those crowlers seem to reduce it quite a bit, and it made it a lot. It was really a pandemic decision. It made it a lot because our business sat up for almost a year for to-go only, and it made it easier to just package this stuff, go outside and give it to people instead of worrying about people bringing in their dirty glass, even though we had a station set up to clean it, rinse it, sanitize it before we served it, just to kind of, alleviate anybody's concerns. But the crowler system was just a really very helpful thing to have for us.
Yeah, and glass growlers are time wasters and beer wasters. If you've got, a line of people waiting for a fresh pint, and your servers are babysitting the growler and pouring off foam, and
it becomes a real pain as an owner watching the beer go down the drain, and as a server having to deal with all that foam. Nobody likes that. So, but we fill quite a few growlers still. The howlers, the 32 ounce, have kind of been replaced by the 32 ounce crowler. But we still fill them, but we just don't sell the glass anymore. The 32 ounce glass, we just don't mess with it. Much
to my wife's dismay, I have a collection of of growlers from all over the country and in the kitchen, gathering dust. They're fun. They're fun to look at, but ultimately impractical. I used to make starters in them, but before I got my Erlenmeyer flask and my stir plate.
Well, it helps you remember where you've been.
Yeah.
You look at all these growlers that you buy when you're somewhere else, and you have fond memories of what was happening when you picked them up.
And there's one or two breweries that aren't around anymore, so they're. We've been lucky here in Northwest Arkansas, especially, where I was thinking on the way over here. I guess we've only lost one brewery, right? And that's Tanglewood Branch.
Well, you could argue that the brew pub on Dixon Street,
that's true.
we lost that one. But we've been.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you could argue. That's a fact. We lost that one. I mean, that was hard to lose that one. But yeah, we've been real lucky. Everybody, I think there's a great community around here that supports local beer, and it's just. It's very fortunate to be a part of that.
Where should we head next?
Might as well drink. You said you hadn't tried that hazy IPA, the New England IPA before, at least 3.5 years ago. So it seems like a great place to go to next.
Boy, that smells good. Of course, Sean, that hazy beers are ruining the craft beer industry.
Yeah, I have yet to experience that.
Just like everybody complains about hard seltzers, but there are breweries that are staying open because they make hard seltzers.
I mean, as a business, you brew what people drink, and if you're fortunate enough to have the ability to brew some of the things that you like on the side as well, that's fantastic. But I mean, as much as you like making beer, you're still running a business, and you got to sell beer to keep the business going. And if people are drinking IPAs, or hazy IPAs, that's what you're making. Fortunately, I like them.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a bunch of hops on the board in there, a bunch of hoppy beers, and you said that you're working on another hoppy beer, even as we speak. And this is delicious, by the way, and I want you to talk about this beer specifically, but. As a small brewery, 3.5 years in, does the acquisition of hops get easier over time now that do you kind of know the system better?
Well, because we're small, it seems like I have not had any issues getting hops since we've been in business. The closest issue that I ever had was Galaxy hops when they went off the charts expensive, and you could buy them, but I decided I wasn't paying $35 a pound for them because I don't have contracts. Everything I do is basically spot hop, and lupulin exchange is fantastic. That allows people to buy on the spot hop market or exchange with other breweries that have more than they need, and that's been real helpful. And I found a really good guy out of Oregon, Ted Hossetter, that does his own hops, and I try to he's a smaller guy, and he has everything I need all the time, so I like to keep that relationship. I want to believe that he's tiny and little like me, and I like to support people like that. So
talk about the specifics of this beer.
So that beer, I made that beer probably 4 or 5 years ago as a home brewer. Was it that long? Yeah, it was roughly that long ago. After I had Juicy Bits from Weldworks up in Greeley. And I was amazed at how fantastic the beer was. And I was thinking to myself, man, if I could just make a beer like this, I'd kill it, And so I sat down and just started reading about, what constitutes a New England or a hazy IPA. I guess the New England guys are like, this is just beer. Everybody else is their New England IPAs. And started looking at, the adjuncts like the wheat and the oats and things, and the heavy late hop additions and the big dry hop additions. And I messed with that for quite some time. Went through many iterations of hops, even here, before we've landed on that final recipe, we had phased, and then it was phase 2, and then phase, various plays on the name before I finally found what it was that I settled on. And that beer has, even though it's been around since almost the beginning, it's our best-selling beer.
Wow.
And it stands up to any specialty beer we make week after week. That if it's not the best selling, it's the second best selling beer, and it's been that way for years now.
And what are the hops?
The Mandarina Bavaria and Simcoe.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow. And where do you? I assume that most, if not all, are either near the end of the boil or in a hop stand, or
most are at the end of the boil. I still, I'm a traditionalist a little bit in the sense that I like to add on the hot side, but they're minuscule amounts because I think it gives us I like bitter IPAs. The West Coast just palate wreckers where I started loving IPAs, and I'm trying. I know most people don't do that as much as they used to, but I still like that flavor, and I wanted to have a little bit of bitterness in the soft aromatic New England IPA, so I just add touch amounts at the 60 and maybe 30, and after that it's all Whirlpool hop stand.
Wow.
All.
And so do you? It's delicious, and what I like about it, I like these beers. I like the juiciness, but I like that yours has that bitterness in there. The B word balances it out. And I've had some really delicious beers where, I've made a couple, 3. With all of the hops post boil essentially, and they are delicious. But if you're a traditional IPA lover, you do miss that sharpness a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's just like anything. You have to respect the style of beer, and you have to know what you're drinking. Like, nobody's going to drink a Belgian Golden Strong and say, "Boy, I hate IPAs," or what. You drink, you recognize the style you're drinking, and you appreciate it for what it is.
You said Belgian Golden Strong. I went back to it. It's really good. And I was going to ask another question, but for some reason, later in the interview, the questions get harder to
get harder to conceive and harder to answer.
Let me tell you about my brew day on Sunday with my Warthog electric brewing system from our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from HighGravityBrew.com. I have the 240-volt, 10-gallon brew-in-a-bag system with the EBC 130 controller. I have the Bayou Classic kettle, but you can upgrade into a Spike kettle if you so desire through the website. Sunday was simple. I put 8 gallons or 30 liters of water into the kettle and turned on the mash mode, and as I went about my business of gathering ingredients and gear, the Warthog controller brought my strike water temp up and held it rock steady. I dove in and mashed for 90 minutes, stirring occasionally and not worrying about whether the temp was falling. Now, with a 10-gallon batch, I'd probably hook up the recirculating pump, but this was just a 5-gallon batch. Then I got a very vigorous boil at just 80% power from that boil coil in the kettle. Bottom line is that an electric system from HighGravityBrew.com will take the pain out of propane, and if you use the code EBC75BB, you can save $75 off your Warthog purchase, which will help your bottom line. Check out all the awesome electric gear from family-owned and operated HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. So maybe I ought to move on to the last beer. And what do we got here?
Well, so that kind of follows in with what I was just talking about, my old West Coast love, and I do really enjoy the East Coast. And so that beer is called Struggle Bus, and it is a, it's an IPA. You're just about to call everything IPAs now, and then you describe the IPA. Is it bitter? Is it aromatic? And it gives people an idea of what kind of style they're after. But like I said, I like the bitter West Coast style. I like the real full body, flavorful aromatics of a East Coast IPA, and I tried to blend those together with a strong hot side hop bill and a strong Whirlpool hop bill, and with I wanted the bitterness to come through, so I mashed very cold, but also added a lot of late hop additions and a lot of dry hop additions to kind of get some of that, I guess, oils out of the hops to give it a little bit more body, but still, have a really crisp IPA, bitter IPA that goes, that's infinitely drinkable as far as I'm concerned. That's what I was drinking when we sat down, and we brew that about 2 or 3 times a year, and that's when it's on tap. That's all I drink.
Yeah, it's super good. And as I tasted it, I was thinking this is a hybrid because it's got the juiciness that you expect from the East Coast, and it's got the bitterness and there is some sweetness from the malt bill. It's in a way, if you just ignore all the hops, it's sweeter than the previous one, but in a good way because again it's balanced by the bitterness, and I think that you have to have that if you're going to build such a strongly hopped beer.
It's definitely assertive for what you would, if you look at it. It's hazy, so everybody's like, oh, that's a hazy IPA, and you have expectations when you come to it, and then you drink it, and it kind of presents a little bit differently than what you would expect.
Yeah, I would call it hazy and not cloudy. Yes. I haven't seen any milkshake beers here. So the question that I was reaching for when I had the brain fart earlier, when you're moving in a similar way, we talk to professional brewers and our audience is mostly home brewers, and we talk about whirlpool hops. The whirlpool time for a home brewer is dramatically shorter than the whirlpool time for a professional brewer, and I would imagine that there's a similar paradigm between your 2-barrel system's whirlpool time and your bigger system's whirlpool time. Do you have to adjust the recipe to kind of account for that?
Well, you definitely do, and that was part of the learning curve as you moved up from a 2-barrel to a 7-barrel system. And there are, sometimes we go hour plus down at the big facility, and everybody worries about DMS forming as things get colder and longer. But we've dropped some of our whirlpool temps down into the 160s, and nothing off shows up. And when we first were doing that, I was extremely nervous. About that because you're wanting to extract the flavor from those hops. You're trying to get the temperature low, and it takes quite a bit longer to get the temperature down over there. And there's a lot of there's some technical issues where it's very difficult to cool 250, 300 gallons of wort without fouling your exchanger, things that you don't want to worry about long term. So we've had to figure out how to do it and still maintain the same flavor profile as we have here. And it definitely extends, but that's not always the case. It hasn't always been the case. So what we have found, though, is the final rest at the end on the big facility takes quite a bit longer here for the cone to compact so that you clarify when you're transferring. And that was something I never expected, and it was something you just learn to deal with, and you adjust as you're going along. So it does in fact add time right off the bat at the very end. So you've done your 30-minute whirlpool, and now you've got another 30 minutes for it to sit there when the whirlpool's over, and you're like, man, this has been here for a long time. I hope there's nothing wrong with this beer.
Do you ever delay? Do you ever watch the temperature and wait for it to drop beyond a certain point before you put the hops in, or is it always like right at the end of the boil and then you start the whirlpool?
We hop throughout a temperature range of about 200 to 160 degrees.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
So you get your electric football game and the vibration football game, the Sam Calagione.
So depending on what I'm trying to accomplish with the beer and what flavors that I'm looking for, will determine whirlpool temperatures a lot, especially for the hops, and the high oil hops. I try to keep pretty cold in the whirlpool in general. So those are the when I'm looking for those flavors, I don't want to lose them, and I try to keep it as cold as possible, But some of the other flavors, like the citrusy or the tropical flavors, I try to read research. I try to at least do a good job at staying abreast of what's happening in the world. And I know, based on a lot of the stuff I've read, the 205 degree gives you quite a bit more of that, tropical flavor. And I think as you move lower and colder, it moves into the more floral and maybe herbal flavors. And knowing that, you kind of balance out your hop load and your timing.
And you're also extracting bitterness along that time, even though it's at a lower percentage than sticking in the boil.
Yeah, and then you're probably, and I don't know, it's all definitely not coming from isomerized acids, that's for sure. So, you have to, that's when a pilot system comes in real handy. Because I certainly don't want to be messing around with stuff on it, even on a 2-barrel system. When I'm making some pretty significant experimental jumps, I try to keep it small.
So,
which is common sense.
Yeah.
I'm not imparting any wisdom that everybody else doesn't do.
Yeah, of course, most of us, our big batches are smaller than your pilot batch probably, but but there's the economies of scale, and there's your expectations as a home brewer. If you're not going to want to spend $60-$80 on an experiment, that might not go exactly right. So even smaller, tiny batches are educational.
Well, that's when as we've grown a little bit, the place has gotten bigger. There's no way I can handle 2 places at once, so I've hired an assistant brewer, and actually even a second assistant brewer that's here learning. And everybody's almost to the point now where I'm going to let them loose, and they're going to be able to start making their beer. I'll let them start developing their own recipes on our pilot system, so that we're not ruining 7 barrels of beer.
And you're passing the torch. I mean, you're not only getting potentially really good ideas from them, you're also empowering them, to use a corporate word, to move on to maybe their next level.
Well, yes, I certainly, selfishly, the idea is to make these people act exactly like I do, so I can sleep at night, and then let them, sometime down the road as I move out, let them move on in and keep this whole thing going for, a long time. I mean, we're trying to be part of the community, and the community doesn't just end when a brewery ends. You got to keep going, and eventually I won't be able to do it, but there needs to be some. They're pretty young, so they can come in behind me and keep this place going.
Wow, that sounds like a place to end. It doesn't always happen as organically as that, but man, this has been a really fun conversation, and I appreciate your generosity, not only in the sampler of beers, but in your time and your knowledge, and I hope that, this is one of the stops. If people email me and say, where should I go in Northwest Arkansas? This is one of the ones that's at the top of the list, because I know there's always going to be good beer here, and again, there's always good barbecue right across the parking lot.
Well, I mean, that's a twofer, right? I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you very much.
Well, Sean, thanks again.
Yeah, anytime. You're more than welcome.
See you in 3.5 years.
Let's make it 2.
Well, thanks again to Sean. What a fun conversation. And congratulations to Sean and Liz for the success, and looking forward to seeing how the next chapter unfolds. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to James at basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. It's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.